you need to be very aware of what that is that they contribute to in terms of your business processes.
Yeah.
And you need to be prepared for the potential that it is going to fail. And just think about that for a second. If your entire business is reliant on that one piece, and you haven't considered what would happen if that fails.
Joining me live now is crisis response and business resilience expert Simon Peaty, who is currently advising Australian businesses impacted by the global CrowdStrike outage.
You need to be preparing for when things go wrong.
Thanks for joining me today on Outage Unplugged. You're the founder of Escalate Consulting, a business resilience firm with over 20 years of experience. You specialise in helping organisations handle crises and ensure business continuity. You've worked with some of the top companies and governments worldwide, guiding them through really tough situations and building their resilience. So I've got to ask, what inspired you to get into the business resilience and crisis management consulting?
Adam, thanks for having me. It's great to be on Outage Unplugged. Business resilience, resilience is a buzzword,
Yep.
but at its heart, it's about solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a services background. Some of my staff have service background, but for me personally, that sense of service is what really drew me to this profession and this element of professional services. I find that we help so many businesses when they are facing disruption or they're preparing for what would be their worst day. I fell into this coming out of defence, and I would say that for anyone that's in a combat or combat support role, crisis management is second nature. Probably what we take for granted in the veteran community is how much training you actually do. So we had completed formal risk management qualifications and training under military risk management, and that was for some fairly intense situations, as you can imagine. But that concept of planning, training, and exercising response procedures was exactly what we would do on a day-to-day basis. Translating that into the civilian world often doesn't come easy, but I found in this particular aspect of work, when we're talking about understanding what is important, protecting those capabilities, and protecting those vulnerabilities of an organisation, to be able to then process information quickly and communicate clearly, they were absolutely skills that came out of my military training. Where I think I had a specific advantage coming into this was through my military training, I also was an instructor. So not only was I conducting these activities as a practitioner, but I was having to train other people on how to do it. That was one of the really interesting parts about me leaving defence, was going through that process of what did I enjoy, what did I think I was good at, and what could I offer. And that concept of training, planning, training, exercising was probably something that I really was gravitating towards. I found this, I latched onto it. Yes, it's risk, yes, it's resilience, but at its heart, it's about response, it's about communication, and it's about problem solving.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I can see the natural sort of progression and transition there from military to civilian. So it makes a lot of sense. So just speaking on crisis and obviously what's transpired with CrowdStrike, I noticed you were actually quite heavily involved in the Australian media and were sought after by a few outlets around the whole incident. So can you give us just a brief, I guess, overview of what kind of happened?
Yeah, the Friday afternoon, so it was on a Friday afternoon, I think the first thing to articulate, and this is something that obviously plays into your area as well, Adam, the first thing that we need to make sure it's clear is it wasn't a cyber attack. However, you've got to remember, and we find that this is the problem in crisis management and business continuity with anything to do with technology. There are people that understand technology, and then there is the rest of us that understand that when I press the button on a computer, it should work, and I'm used to it working. So ultimately, with the CrowdStrike issue, the first thing that businesses saw and our customers saw was that their computer system was offline, and it was either the entire system with the blue screen of death, which and I love that terminology that everyone now understands.
It's an old one.
Yep. With the frowny face sitting there telling you essentially computer says no.
Yep.
The reason why CrowdStrike I think was concerning for a lot of businesses is if you think about the crises and the events that we see more frequently here in Australia. So severe weather, bushfires, even the pandemic in terms of what we were experiencing there. You can see it, you can touch it, you can taste it,
it's tangible.
Absolutely. And as I said, for us mere mortals that aren't addicts and in your world, ultimately I go back to that Owen Wilson, Ben Stiller scene from Zoolander where they're staring going, it's in the computer. So we know there's something wrong.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if you don't, and I was reflecting on CrowdStrike saying, I don't even know how to start a computer in safe mode anymore because of how fast technology has gone. So if I can go back to what we saw businesses immediately impacted by disruption.
Yep.
As a result of that, we saw core service offerings unable to operate in the way that they would as part of business as usual. What that does from our side, from a crisis management business continuity sense, crisis management is about then the stabilization of the viability, reputation, or strategic processes of a business in the market. Incident management is about stabilizing those operations. We had businesses struggling to even understand what was broken, and that's why we saw such concern over those first hours of the CrowdStrike event.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because when I started talking to just everyday people, they're very confused about what the actual issue was, and there was a lot of talk around it being a Microsoft issue.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of confusion, conflation, and I know there was some talk about a Microsoft outage, either prior or as it was happening, and it was getting a bit confused.
Yeah.
Is that what you saw as well?
Yeah, we saw that. So earlier in the day, so if you think about CrowdStrike in a timeline being about that 2 o'clock period, at about 10:30, 11, we were already getting reports of there being some type of Microsoft impact. And ultimately, that's why I think a lot of IT teams, and I think that's worth coming back to, is an IT team in Australian business. But that concept of an IT team already responding to an event, and as you say, starting to confuse some of the reports that may be coming through their network of we're seeing another impact. Is it Microsoft? And as we've learned, yes, CrowdStrike is an absolute supplier to Microsoft, but it wasn't a Microsoft outage. It was actually the CrowdStrike and their operating system outage.
Yeah. No, I definitely saw that as well. So just from that experience, I've got like a bit of a two-part sort of question for you. Is like, what are the key sort of takeaways from the CrowdStrike thing? Like, obviously, it's the biggest sort of outage we've faced maybe ever, or for quite some time. And then the other question that I get a lot is, how do businesses actually better prepare for such an incident? Like I get that question a lot. Like, oh, well, if I can't use my computer, well, then I just can't run my business. So, is that like acceptable? Like, is that? I know that's a bit of an open term.
It's a great question. So, I think it does come back into a single response there, which is, it is not acceptable for a business to you can outsource your services, but you will never outsource your risk, or you should not. And I would always encourage businesses to acknowledge they cannot outsource their risk. So even though that you may require other resources and external support to enable your business to be efficient and drive profitability within your business, with each of those decisions comes an element of risk. Now, so is it good enough for Australian businesses or businesses in general to have one of those resources be disrupted and then blame that resource on the fact that they can't do business? No.
Yep.
It's not. And I think that's one of the key takeaways that we've seen is that businesses were not prepared because, again, Microsoft is too big. And ultimately, when you start to dig into the CrowdStrike outage, CrowdStrike being the leader and one of the leaders.
Yeah, they're one of the biggest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is not expected that those type of businesses have outage. However, I've heard people talk about this being a wake-up call. Adam, like
COVID was a wake-up call, you know?
And ultimately, when you actually look at this outage and what it did, don't think about the cause, think about the consequence.
Yep.
So the consequence to businesses was that essentially that their operating system was offline. We saw an identical consequence as a result of the Optus network outage, where businesses couldn't use their pay points because they didn't have internet. Businesses couldn't use their phones. They couldn't use some of their systems. Their customers couldn't access services in the same way because of that outage.
Yeah.
I see this as very, very similar in terms of Optus was just another supplier. CrowdStrike, Microsoft, your technology provider, is a supplier. You need to be very aware of what that is that they contribute to in terms of your business processes.
Yep.
And you need to be prepared for the potential that it is going to fail. And if it is that crucial to you, and just think about that for a second, if your entire business is reliant on that one piece, and you haven't considered what would happen if that fails, you haven't done any risk planning at all. And that's where we would suggest going through not just an identification of the importance of, for your core activities, what do you rely on, but then starting to go through that process of, do we have resources or do we have workarounds that could be put in place if we have a disruption?
Yeah, it's a really good point because when I talk to businesses, I get met with, well, we're all in the same boat. Like if I can't do business because my computers are down and my competitors and everyone else is down, well, it's just the way it is. And I think it's because they don't know what they don't know.
Yes.
Or they just accept it because, oh, well, what else is there? And they don't know what other workarounds or they haven't put enough thought into how we would do alternate ways of working.
And it is a weird way of thinking, and I will admit that to you that no one goes into a business immediately thinking that it's going to fail or it's going to go badly. It is a unique skill set of always looking at the world in terms of crisis management and disaster response and recovery. But it is one that it isn't rocket science. It just takes concerted effort, as you say, and it takes a thought process to really get to that point of saying, well, do I actually have the resources? Do I have the capabilities? If I lose this integral component of my process, do I have another way of doing it? Now, the answer may be no. And that's one of the points that I again think hasn't been discussed. Here in Australia, we expect stuff to work.
Yeah.
We are used to everything working all the time. With where the world is going to, not just the reliance on technology, but also the disruptions that we're starting to see and the scale of those disruptions that we're starting to see. The reality, Adam, unfortunately, is yes, this occurred. Yes, we will see another outage in a technology world that will be of similar scale or bigger into the future. And we know that Australian businesses potentially, essentially have a 100% reliance on Microsoft.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's so we know that is a vulnerability. We know that is a concentration point. Yep. And so if you think about that, if you are treating this as a wake-up call and not an immediate call to action, you really need to be thinking right now about where this goes for you. And the simple answer is if you finished work on Friday and your business immediately went back into the 1970s, that's a really simple question is, well, how would we have done this in the 1970s? And maybe I do need that extra part-time staff member. Maybe I do need to cross-train. Maybe I need to have that particular form that is all I need my computer for is to fill out that form. Maybe I need to have 3 or 4 of those printed out in a drawer somewhere. or at least on a remarkable or something else that you can fill out that isn't directly linked to your primary operating system, that enables you to at least take that first step and get through that first 6 to 12 hours.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Just thinking about the CrowdStrike crisis as a whole, and you know, for the businesses out there that provide, you know, let's just say critical or important things to their customer base, if they are going through a crisis, or even just relating it back to the CrowdStrike, you know, what are those critical elements of affecting that, or, you know, like managing that crisis properly? Like, I've heard a lot of commentary around CrowdStrike and their lack of communication.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like communication's pretty critical in a crisis.
Yep.
Is it a case of being underprepared for a crisis and not having a plan?
I think we can be. I think we can absolutely be critical, and I've been careful as a practitioner because it wasn't a cyber attack, and that wasn't their core service offering. But they're still a technology provider, and they still had a failure in their technology. So the piece that I would say there is that for a business that has a service offering of running cybersecurity exercising, their response to an IT event was poor.
Yep.
The fact that when the first official response came out, it was in blog form. The fact that some of their staff were communicating via social media, via X and via Reddit and via some of others, it was not the controlled, coordinated response that you would expect from a market leader. And I think I do believe that people can be critical about that.
And that kind of makes it a bit worse too, doesn't it? When you have different messaging going out on different platforms via probably unsanctioned, you know, or unapproved forms and staff, you know, especially with Reddit and X and stuff like that. So it probably turns that crisis even into a more of a...
Yeah, and I think because of who CrowdStrike is, and when we found out that it was a CrowdStrike issue, I think the anxiety and the uncertainty around the fact of was it a cyber attack, really added to the stress and the ability of businesses to actually want to respond quickly.
Yeah.
So I know of businesses that even when CrowdStrike put out the official patch, that they were waiting for not just verification, but they didn't want to be the first business to put that patch in place in case it was cyber related and there was some type of cover up. So I know of major and critical infrastructure businesses in this country that the rumor mill had gone off because of the lack of communication, and they were treating it, despite the official messaging of this is an IT issue, and it was essentially an update issue. They were treating it as a cyber attack until essentially the government came out at about 6 o'clock following the emergency management meeting and the cybersecurity coordinator publicly stating that it is not a cyber attack. That was the only fact that they trusted.
Which is interesting because I don't want to get into conspiracy theories too much, but one of the leading ones was that you're very quick to say it's not a cyber attack, which makes people wonder, would you even know if it was?
Yeah.
But, you know, it's something to...
And this is, again, we talk about the cause versus the consequence, and I think that becomes really important in response. And you talked about what is important in crisis management.
Yep.
I would say perspective is probably the most important piece.
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by perspective is taking a breath and saying, what do we own? What can we control? So CrowdStrike was huge. It was on the front page of every major media agency in the world. It was across every form of media. And so you then had small up to enterprise businesses trying to wade through all of this noise, whereas being able to have the ability, the processes, the controls to then say, all right, who's our team? What's the impact, and what is the impact that we own, and what is within our resources, capability, and authority to start to resolve? Because you're not going to solve CrowdStrike as a small business here in Brisbane or Australia. You can't solve that problem. What you can solve is the fact that you can't use your FPOS machine so you can take cash or another form of payment. And this is the fascinating part about if you can't use that, and again, I'm not asking people to jump straight to cash, but do you have an alternate method to be able to take that electronic payment?
Yeah. So, and you've spoken about it quite at length already, but if you were their crisis management expert and you were embedded, or they called you and said, Simon, look, this is what's happening, what would be your, let's just say, top 3 things you would have done as their consultant?
Essentially, conducting an impact assessment to say, okay, what has been impacted in terms of priority? And then the second component that we would very quickly move to is how we communicating effectively internally to our organisation and then externally to our key stakeholders. The interesting part about the response is prior preparation is really important in crisis management. The worst time to learn how to manage a crisis is during a crisis. Yeah. So if you think about why we put such emphasis on planning, if you're going into that response knowing exactly who your response team is, knowing exactly who your stakeholders are, and from a business continuity perspective, understanding very clearly what are the priority services, activities, and your own processes that you need to be able to respond to, it gives you that information gives you clarity in terms of your response prioritization. Yeah. So the first thing that, if I would have gone in, the first thing that I would have tried to have made sure is are our staff currently working through, are they okay? And it is that old adage of put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. Yeah. Because if CrowdStrike is not okay, if they're not safe, if they're not in a position to respond, no one else is getting anything. So the first thing that I would have done is, where do we sit? What is our current position? And then I would have started to work through the impact with others. And then I would have finished with the communication strategy. And then I would have got people out of the room. This is critical, Adam. And I see this so often that I've seen organisations get into this concept of having a 24/7 war room. Their operational level, their IT major incident management team, or equivalent response team who was working through that problem, they are on. Like they are in it, they are on, and they are working forward. The leadership of that business, if they are trying to work through that same problem at a rate where they are not being able to communicate effectively, understand the impacts, and that's why I suspect it took so long, is that entire business shrunk very quickly. Right. And everybody within that business, because you read through who their leadership are, they are very technologically minded. Yes. And I guarantee that strategic team probably crunched down on the operational team and was in the mix trying to understand the root cause, rather than being able to gain perspective of, we own the strategic piece, we own the communication, we own the ability to manage our stakeholders, our expectation and obligations from here, and then being able to get on with the strategic response versus the operational response.
That's actually a really interesting point, because I'm pretty sure I read something very similar about the Optus scenario, where they had a 24/7 war room, and I think it was very much that senior executives meddling in the operational and doing exactly what you say. So just off the back of that, obviously that's one of the key mistakes. What other mistakes do you see organisations make? Like, let's say for our listeners out there that are listening going, this is great, we're going to go and do some planning and some crisis management. What are some things to avoid, like pitfalls?
Yeah, so probably the biggest pitfall that we see is siloing of information. And just because you do have plans and you do have the structures, we don't want to take away from the responsibility of lower level teams to deal with everyday events. Yeah. So we don't want to, even though good practice would state prudent over-escalation followed by rapid de-escalation, we still want to get to a point where if it's within the resources, the capability, and the authority, and I've said that before, but that's kind of the trinity at the moment. Okay. If it's within the resources, capability, and authority of a lower team, the expectation is that you deal with it. Yep. The reason it should escalate, pardon the pun, but escalate from a team up through the levels is it breaches one of those. Okay. So even if you put that into the CrowdStrike, I guarantee that IT team probably had the capability and the resources to identify the fault and patch. What they didn't have was the resources, capability, and authority to communicate to the entire stakeholder network of CrowdStrike across the world. So that was the piece that needed to be extracted from them. So what I would say to organizations is the pitfalls that we see teams going into is that is the challenge of when do you trigger from one team to another, and not taking away from the experience and the capability of teams to deal with it at a lower level. So plans become important to make sure that we know what the ownership of each of those different tiers within your business and those different response streams or response levels can actually handle. If you can understand that, then you can start to build confidence in terms of your response, saying, okay, where are we sitting? We know that lower level team is now dealing with something there. Do we need to activate a higher team? No, they've got it. I've got confidence to allow them to do that.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just on the planning part, and I want to talk like business continuity.
Yes.
Like, what are the really key, I guess, components of a robust business continuity plan? I think a lot of businesses also confuse or conflate business continuity with disaster recovery.
Yes.
And what actually separates the two.
I'm so glad that you've raised this, because it is a bugbear of mine. So disaster recovery, as you and I both understand it, is very much an IT function, and it is about the ability to recover the applications and systems, and usually that involves data recovery as well, back to a recovery point or time as you're going. So business continuity is very much about the recovery of critical business function. So it is about
business function.
It's business function. So it's your processes, your activities. So the critical components, and you talked about that people do confuse these. There's a reason, and I'm going to be critical again. The business continuity plans that are available on Australian government websites are crap. And when I mean that they are bad, they do not meet any international standards. They are trying to condense emergency management, incident management, crisis management, all into
trying to do too much.
Yeah. And the other thing it does is it limits the amount of information that a business tries to put in there, because they are trying to do 3 different things rather than just focusing on what happens if something breaks. And that's the oversimplification of it. So the best part about business continuity and the key part about business continuity is actually data. Because if somebody talks about, well, my business continuity is just getting the right people in the room and I'm sure we'll make it up as we go, I can tell you that under stress and pressure, that's not how your brain works.
Yeah.
And you really do require those control measures and that information set to be able to move through efficiently, because there isn't that many people in the world that can operate under that level of stress of a really genuine disruption and make sound decisions with good prioritization. That's a skill, right?
Yeah.
But if you've got a really good data set of understanding what are those core processes of your business and what are the dependencies of that process, that way you can identify if something breaks, what does it actually impact? And you can actually start to follow that thread through.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. So off the back of that, and this is probably one of my bugbears, is you'll walk in, you'll talk to a customer, a potential customer, and you'll ask them about business continuity. Yep, we've got that plan. I have a look at it.
Yes.
And it was updated 4 years ago, and they've never once tested it. So how crucial is it that, not only are these plans created, but they're also kept up to date and actually tested? Like, how often would you test a BC plan? Yeah,
so good practice, it's really easy. Good practice is annually. But in terms of updating your plan, and you and I have talked at length about my clients, and even you at it supporting us as one of your clients, about how fast we have changed over the last couple of years. So for business continuity plans, annually, or if there is a change, a significant or a strategic change within your business. That could be a structural change, it could be a supplier change, it could be anything that's going to change the way that you would conduct one of those processes. You should at least do a review of what that looks like. Now, testing is something that's a little bit more interesting, because I would, and this is probably a little bit controversial in my world, because you could say annually, but I would say annually if you have not activated it within that time.
Yeah, okay.
Because if you've activated your plan, you should be then conducting a review to see whether the plan actually worked. So if you're using your plan regularly, there is no requirement to continually test it. Now, the only caution there is unless you're in a regulated industry where by regulation you must conduct an independent exercise. And we're seeing that not only within critical infrastructure, finance, etc., but we're also seeing that for suppliers into those industries as well.
Yeah.
So make sure that you understand what your obligations are, I would say.
I think we are seeing a lot more scrutiny around that supply chain too, just by nature of, I guess, the attacks that are coming out these days, which leads me to my next thing is, and we spoke a little bit just before the podcast around a particular scenario you faced around cybersecurity and an incident. And I just want to get your take on, I guess, what you see from your end as some of the biggest sort of cybersecurity threats facing businesses today. Like, what are you seeing out there with your customers? And how are you dealing with that?
So probably the first thing that I would say is that there is a gap that is now occurring in Australian business. And I'm going to use Australian business as the real driver here, where we're seeing larger businesses invest heavily into cybersecurity and data protection. What we're seeing on the opposite end is the third parties, fourth parties of those businesses, the small to medium enterprises, not being able to keep up with the requirements of cybersecurity and are allowing that to lapse. And so what we're now seeing is that you will have a business spending millions of dollars at the top end, and you will have a business who is one of their suppliers just doing, like having no active cybersecurity and doing basic data management, pretty much just to tick the box of governance under the due diligence of the contract. That is all. So the first problem that I would see in cybersecurity is now the divide between top-tier businesses and smaller businesses in the country. The second thing that we would see there is just how fast that space is evolving. Like, we hear all the time about phishing, we hear all the time about extortion or encryption, but when we actually say, what does that physically look like? I would say the majority of businesses in this country, no one. Like, if you haven't seen it firsthand, it's actually really difficult to understand what it could physically look like. And if you're not employing the monitoring software, either through your own personal devices or through a supplier, you actually have no idea whether or not you've been compromised already. And so they would be the biggest problems that I would see, the divide, but also the actual currency and understanding where you stand in terms of your own security.
Yeah, look, you've touched on a lot of things, and I think it's 100% accurate. I think, these small, medium enterprises are, they don't know what they don't know. They're one of the most targeted out of all of them. I think most breaches are through SMEs. There's some things coming down, very, very soon through the Privacy Act and the reforms coming through there. And there's talks about, potentially scrapping the $3 million threshold. So what's that going to mean to these small, medium enterprises? And I notice in a lot of these civil suits with the OAIC, and bear in mind they are the top of town, they're the Medibanks, the Australian Clinical Labs and stuff like that. They are looking at a business's overall revenue and then asking what their expenditure is on IT and then cyber.
Yes.
And if there is a massive disparity between them, they class that as not taking reasonable steps, amongst other things. So it's really, it's a really multifaceted problem we have.
I know of at least one client when I called and said, "Hey, are you impacted?" They went, "No, we went cheap." So we didn't. We got a quote from CrowdStrike.
Yeah, couldn't afford it.
We couldn't afford it. So we went with the cheaper option. That's the only reason we're not impacted.
Wow.
And so when you then think about, as you say, this, how can small to medium enterprise keep up? And I think this is where, please, and I'm just going to give the free plug here, mate. This is where talking to IT providers like Outage and saying, how can you help? Like, what does that look like? And trying to really work with your IT provider, whoever that may be, to be able to still understand what is the threat. Like, where are my vulnerabilities? What are the things that I really need to cover?
Yeah. And I think, speaking about plugs and stuff, but I think we've done a pretty good job of understanding where SMEs need to be.
Yep.
And there's been some really good work too. Like, I know in the early days, the government and the ACSE brought out the Essential 8, and that was a good start, I think. Yep. 8 sort of technical controls, yep, great. But there's other things coming out now, like the CSCAU, and I've spoken about this ad nauseum before, around the SMB 1001 framework. I think that is like a really, really good framework for these SMEs to undertake, because it's tangible, it covers not just technical, it does the process, the policy and the people aspect of it, which is often overlooked. This old day of go throw some lights in a cupboard and, you're protected, they're long gone, because all it takes is someone putting in their password and getting multi-factor fatigued, even if they have multi-factor enabled, which not enough have.
Yes.
That's still becoming a thing. I mean, look at, Medibank. It was through a third-party IT provider who didn't have MFA.
Yep.
And then you talk about not even knowing if you're compromised. And I think the average dwell time is over 200 days.
Yes.
Before it's even discovered.
And then you add to this, so I think I want to reinforce back for you here that concept of, if I can take it back to that trinity of resources, capability, right? Now, you have the authority to make a decision, but we're talking about resources and capabilities that are very niche. Now, again, if you think about a small to medium business, let's just take a manufacturing business, the ability to employ enough resources to do this properly is not feasible for them. Yeah. Like, I was on a call with a school this morning, and we're then talking about data to do with kids, to do with all of this piece, and there's a cybersecurity manager, an IT manager. That's essentially it. So they are so reliant on the service providers who have those additional resources to be able to support them. Yeah. So I think that becomes really important. The analogy that I would put forward here is, you don't go to a mechanic to paint your house, right? If you're going to do something properly, go to someone who can actually talk with confidence, who has the resources, has the knowledge, has the capability to be able to give you some solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the capability is the big piece, and I think not enough IT providers out there are talking about privacy as well.
Yep.
Like, one of the biggest things about data breaches is breaches to privacy, and that's what you're actually being held accountable for, and around that sort of data that you hold. So I'd like to see a bit of a mental shift too in providers, not just throwing out the Essential 8 just because it's the only framework they know, and actually understanding what they're trying to protect, what those biggest things are like, and that will depend on the industry. Medical, healthcare, non-for-profit, stuff like that, all these ones that need to comply with the Privacy Act. I really think there needs to be more conversation from IT providers around privacy. So I just want to, before we close out, I just want to get sort of your predictions for the next 12 months. What does it look like in the crisis management and business resiliency space? Do you foresee any more sort of big outages? Do you think this is going to be a common occurrence? I know it's not overly common at this stage, but as technology sort of advances, is it?
I think we've got an over-reliance on technology, but that's not going away. The technology has built efficiency and it's built profitability into business. We're able to do so much more. We're so much more we're so much more interconnected with the world. It's shrunk the world so much. So that's not changing. So we live in a world that is uncertain and changing. Like, the World Economic Forum puts out the Global Risk Report. They talk about the outlook being stormy.
Stormy?
Yes. I would say personally,
sounds ominous.
It is ominous. And what always makes me the most interested is when Australia pops its head out and starts to kind of throw stones from our little island down here in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Kind of sit there and realistically, the Australian public has not lived in a time of conflict in our generation. Yeah. The rest of the world has. And I even mean that going into North America through to South America. This instability, both at a civil level and geopolitical level, is real for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
The ability for that to impact us is absolutely real and present. Be that through foreign interference, be that through direct targeting of our critical infrastructure. So if you think about CrowdStrike being the recent piece, you just have to then take that one tiny step further into our power grid, our water grid, our
critical infrastructure.
Correct.
Yeah. AI.
Yes.
Good, bad, or neutral?
Bad now, good in the future. And what I mean by that is I think it's outweighed, and especially in your space around IT, I think it favours the attacker at the moment. It favours those that are looking to use it for malicious intent.
Yep.
I don't think it's going to take long for that to play catch up.
Is that because businesses really struggle about how they would see AI helping their business to do good, whereas attackers are like, I know how I can use this to craft my next phishing email or train my large language model to read a bunch of emails to prepare for my next attack.
Yep.
Is that sort of...
I think absolutely. And I also think there's just that uncertainty about what's safe to use and in that AI space. Like, can I upload a file? Can I upload personal information? Because the vast majority of warnings is no.
They should watch my webinar.
Correct.
That I did lately.
And it is that concept, Adam, of where can you take it and what can you use it for safely and in a responsible manner. Again, it's here to stay. It's now about understanding what is the opportunity, but meeting the risk. So doing your risk assessment, not shying back from that, but stepping right up to the plate and going, yep, this is where I'm prepared to go. This is where I'm going to seek opportunity, and not passing that threshold of putting yourself at risk and in danger.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I agree. I think it's definitely here to stay. I think there's going to be some good things coming. I don't think it's going to take too long until we see some real tangible benefits from it. And I kind of relate it to the internet.
Yeah.
You know, when the internet first came out and people were like, I'll never do banking, and they were like, oh no, you just get scammed and all this. And now it's like an everyday thing. Like, we just have our bank apps on our phone and we transfer money like no dramas at all. But 20 years ago it was a no way.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was this concept of maybe it was because it was slower when you and I
potentially
were younger,
the old dial-up. I'm keen to see how this unravels. And
I think it's exciting. But understanding, like, having confidence in your position, having confidence in what you're prepared to do and what you're prepared to weather, gives you that opportunity to really embrace change and really move forward with confidence. So, I'm excited as well.
No, me too. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us today, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed this conversation.
No
and I know you actually also have your own podcast.
Yeah, we... again, pardon the pun, but that escalated quickly.
Great name.
Available on kind of podcast services, and looking to we're just doing our next round. So we did a few last year. Now next round coming up soon.
Excellent, awesome. Look forward to listening to them. So thanks so much, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thank
you.